just go ahead and get started. I'm Carrie Bourne. I'm from the Office of Continuing Education. We host the Fairhaven Lecture Series here at Fairhaven Senior Services, and have been doing so since 1983. Just a reminder to the folks in the audience and anyone who might be joining us live, we are wearing masks. We're wearing masks for the entire presentation because that's UW Whitewater's policy, and we're here at Fairhaven. It's a UW Whitewater sponsored program, so we're going to follow their rules today. But today we have Professor Anne Drust. Anne has taught at UW Whitewater in the Department of Educational Foundations since 2002. Before coming to UW Whitewater, she was an instructor at the University of California, Davis. While in California, she also taught elementary school in the Sacramento Charter School. Previously, she worked as a researcher in the area of school reform in New York City, as a preschool teacher in New Mexico and Paris, and as an instructor in American history and the history of education. She finished her PhD at UW-Madison with a dissertation on the history of daycare in the United States. Her recent research includes a historical study of the University of Chicago's laboratory school community, 1896 to 1904. She is currently working on a study of the Eagleswood School, an experimental school started by abolitionists in the mid-19th century, and connecting that to innovation, innovative education, and teacher education more broadly. Please welcome Professor Anne Drust.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I really appreciate it. It's wonderful to see you.
Just a little closer to you.
Oh, closer. Is that better? Thanks for letting me know. Welcome, and wonderful to see you on a chilly Valentine's Day. As Carrie said, I'm talking today about educational innovators, profiles from the American past with connections to the present. At a recent panel presentation in Burlington, Vermont in October, public school teachers and students discussed the innovative projects they were engaged in at the elementary, middle, and high school levels. After they were asked how they found the energy and motivation to create these projects, particularly during a pandemic, one teacher said, "Those of us up here are not superheroes, but we are rebellious." From the stories the students and teachers shared, it was clear that this was a rebelliousness that served to improve the common good. One of the panelists said that they, quote, think as a group and as a collective. So in my talk today, I'm going to explore that rebellious spirit in educators from the past. The teachers and students of the Eagleswood School at the utopian community of Raritan Bay Union in the 1850s. Those involved in John Dewey's laboratory school at the turn of the 20th century. And the black teachers connected to the educational networks created by Carter G. Woodson and others in Jim Crow America. I've done archival research on Eagleswood and the laboratory school, but only secondary research on Carter G. Woodson, most notably in Jarvis R. Given's outstanding book of 2021, Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson, and the Art of Black Teaching. So the questions I'm pursuing, and I've been interested in for a long time, in a lot of different ways, I suppose. What motivates individuals and collectives to enact innovation and change in education? What does it take to be educationally rebellious, like the Vermont teachers? This is also a profound question for historians. How did individuals throughout history know to resist and have the courage to act on that knowledge? And in particular for educational historians, how did some educators resist the dominant American curriculum and pedagogy in order to create something new? So today I'm going to give you some profiles in educational innovation and rebellion. What I think links these different groups is the purposeful creation of educational experiences that support independent thinking while also promoting the civic health of the community. So my talk will go chronologically. I'm going to start with Eagleswood. The 1850s was a decade of intense turmoil and decisions of great import by government and individuals in the United States, particularly around the central issue of the time, which was slavery. The The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, according to historian Eric Foner, quote, required citizens to assist in the capture of fugitives and forced ordinary Northerners who had no connection with the abolitionist movement to confront the question of the relationship between individual conscience and legal obligation. Citizens were either complicit with slavery or lawbreakers. Barbara Smith Bowditch-on, an English visitor to the U.S. in 1857 and 58, explained the decade in this way. Some great questions there are which are ever before us. Every hour of the day brings up occasion of action involving these questions, and we have to consider how we shall act, and we see what is the result of our action. The Times presented the demand to think for oneself, though certainly not all answer that demand. One group that did so were the luminaries of interconnected reform movements that came together for a brief moment of time at Eagleswood School in Raritan Bay Union, which was a utopian community in New Jersey, in what was described as a beautiful spot on the Raritan River near New York City. I tried to see this beautiful spot once when I was in New Jersey, but there was nothing left from that. So I just have to go on the historical record to say that it was beautiful. I love to visit the physical locations of the history that I study. The school was started in 1854 by abolitionists Theodore Weld, Angelina Grimke, and Sarah Grimke. Raritan Bay and Eagleswood attracted quite an array of what a student called Mr. Weld's distinguished friends. The utopian community was something like a European salon where people gathered to discuss and meet. When civil disobedience and Walden author Henry David Thoreau visited Raritan in 1856 to survey the land and give lectures to the community, he encountered Angelina Weld, as he wrote, in extreme bloomer costume, which you might call remarkable. Sarah Grimke, her sister, didn't necessarily disagree. She wrote about wearing bloomers, "It does so violate my taste and is so opposed by my secretiveness." The Grimke Welds had radical ideas on just about everything, on daily matters such as clothing and on food as well. They were adherents to what was called the Grahamite diet, which was very, very basic, very plain food, no stimulants. And the Eagleswood School diet was correspondingly Spartan. Unsurprisingly, students commented in their letters, usually negatively, on the food at the boarding school. As one student wrote to her friend, quote, "I would give my entire stock of cakes and sliced ham, which mother put up for me before I left home, to have thee here with me this afternoon." And that is not saying a little in a place where they welcome spring with baked beans and molasses, impertinently ignoring shad, radishes, and other good things which God hath given us to make merry on. The school was shaped in deeper ways by the Groomkie Weld family's ultra ideas, and ultra was a word for radical at the time. Their ultra ideas on profound matters of racial and gender equality. Not all white abolitionists shared their belief in equality and what they called human rights. The Groomkie Sisters were born in South Carolina to a white family that enslaved African Americans. The sisters abhorred slavery and moved north, where they gave public lectures arguing for abolition. Their work in the anti-slavery movement led them to agitate also for equal rights for women. Sarah Grimke believed that, quote, "if we could rouse a spirit of independence in women, our work as to her rights would be accomplished." As she wrote to Henry Bellows, whose children would later enroll at Eagleswood, if women had equal rights, they would be able to, quote, "take enlarged and comprehensive views, to think for themselves, to reason out a point, and form their own conclusions." So it follows that if girls had equal educational opportunities, as Sarah and Angelina Grimke had not, they were mostly self-taught, they could develop independence of mind and the desire to fight for additional rights. It's important to remember here that female suffrage in the U.S. would not come until 1920, so this was a long way off. So my questions here: does a desire for equal rights come from opportunities to think for oneself? Or does one have to learn to think for oneself in order to desire and agitate for equal rights? What did the Grimke Welds and other teachers think about this? What is the role of education in shaping such views? Eagleswood School provided opportunities for what they called scholars, we say students, but they said scholars, to develop these interconnected aspirations and abilities, boys and girls, black and white students, those who were well-to-do, and those of moderate means. Barbara Smith Bodachon, the English visitor, also visited Eagleswood when she was in the U.S. She wrote, "I never saw such a satisfactory group of young people in my life. Mr. Weld is working out every day his principles of equal advantages for black or white or male or female." So Thoreau, who visited, didn't agree about the young people there. He thought that they didn't hold a candle to the children of New England. And for student Ellen Wright, the feeling was somewhat mutual. She thought Thoreau, and I'm pretty sure she said, was by far, her writing wasn't clear, but I think what she said in a letter was by far the strangest piece of humanity that I ever saw. It could have been strongest, but I'm pretty sure she wrote strangest. The experiment of Eagleswood was to connect a belief in equal rights to educational methods that prompted children to think for themselves. In addition to the Grimke Welds, the teaching corps also included several other gifted teachers mentioned often in students' letters, including Lucy Shepherd, Catherine or Kitty Innes Ireland, who's pictured here, Elizabeth Peabody, and Eliza Ann Yeomans. No one was mentioned as much as Theodore Weld, who was a really beloved teacher there. So Eliza Yeomans taught chemistry and botany at Eagleswood. I'm sorry, the picture is tiny up there, but that is her. She wrote several books on botany some years later. Her written work from this period illustrates the pedagogical basis for the unorthodox practices at Eagleswood. In her first book of botany, designed to cultivate the observing powers of children, published in 1870, and it's important here to note that John Dewey, who I'm going to talk about in a bit, who was our preeminent educational philosopher, he was just 11 years old at this time. So, and his ideas were considered ahead of his time. So this is quite in advance of many people who would think this way. So Yeomans wrote that she set out to address what she considered to be nothing less than the true mental philosophy of education. Yeomans explained that the student, quote, must make his own way and rely on nobody else. Traditional schools, in her mind, were, quote, deficient by making no adequate provision for cultivating the growth of ideas by the exercise of the observing powers of children. Her experiences led her to believe that children, quote, should be taught to see for themselves, she italicized that, and to think for themselves on the basis of what they have seen. In this way only can they learn to weigh the true value of evidence and to guard against that carelessness of assumption and that credulous confidence in the loose statements of others, which is one of the gross mental deficiencies we everywhere encounter. For Yeomans, true education must involve observing, inquiring, finding things out, and judging independently about them. While this written work was published after her time at Eagleswood, her ideas align with the record on the school's pedagogical approach. And whenever I read these again, I think she could be describing our time as well, I think. Pliny Earle was a cousin of Raritan Bay founder Rebecca Spring, and he visited the school several times. In a publication of 1898, he wrote that he thought it, on the whole, the best school I ever saw. His description of a classroom lesson taught by Theodore Weld illustrates the ideas outlined by Eliza Ann Yeomans. Weld provided his natural philosophy scholars with an armful of tools, shears, hammers, steelyards, and then he told the students to, quote, examine them and be prepared, each of you, to give a lecture on them, demonstrating the principle by which each act. And please remember that I wish each of you, in examining them, to depend on his own powers of observation and not ask explanations from others. So like Yeomans, he was focused on students learning how to observe and then think on the basis of those observations. Pliny Earle thought that this is the way to make good scholars. He mentioned also the Shakespearean analysis, which happened at the school. Theodore Weld loved Shakespeare, and that was one of his most important areas of instruction for him. In the Shakespearean analysis, the student would rely upon himself and does not fall into the carelessness which always marks those whose teachers are constantly assisting them. He also noted that the whole school, teachers, scholars, male and female, went to, quote, slide and skate on the ice. Even Mrs. Weld, sober, staid, intellectual, Angelina Grimke that was, joined in the pastime. A former student, Anne Drust, remembered the school as a place where students didn't just memorize, but they were taught to think. She remembered a trigonometry lesson that involved students walking on a hillside and using surveying tools to measure distance and altitude. By doing that, she said, that kind of experience enabled students to develop a true interest in their studies. The children at Eagleswood came from mostly like-minded families, central of whom were members of an interconnected network of reformers that one contemporary referred to as the Northern Emancipationist Circle in upstate New York and in Philadelphia. The scholars included Ellen Wright, who's pictured here between her brothers, who also attended the school. Ellen Wright was, quote, she said, thankful to be bred among reformers. And indeed she was. She was the daughter and niece of two women who organized the Seneca Falls Convention for the Rights of Women in 1848, with the more famous Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Her mother was Martha Coffin Wright, and her aunt was Lucretia Coffin Mott. Another scholar was Ellen's cousin, Anna Davis, Lucretia Mott's grandmother, in the lower photo there. And their friend, Lucy McKim, whose father, Miller McKim, was an abolitionist, active in the Underground Railroad. Ellen Wright called Eagleswood a wonderful and delightful school, while Lucy McKim called it that most radical of all places. Judging from the many letters written by the children of the Wright, Mott, and McKim families, it seemed to be both. A vibrant place full of skating, swimming, excursions, gymnastics, dancing, acting, and performing. And these activities coexisting with quite serious scholarly studies in Shakespeare, compositions, debates, trigonometry, Latin, and Greek. All of this taught using pedagogical methods that were atypical in an age of memorization, towing the line, and recitation. And it was notable that at Eagleswood, as recorded in teachers' and students' letters, the community discussed the critical issues of the day, including slavery, in lectures from guests and teachers, and in the students' conversations. While many of the children came from abolitionist families, this wasn't the case for all. Ellen Wright wrote of another student, Mary Morris is pro-slavery, and she says she's going home because we pick her so about it. We ought to have a discussion next Sunday on slavery. 4 years later, Anna Davis wrote about Theodore Weld's 1858 anti-slavery speech at the school that brought some students to tears. Other students, Davis wrote, made it arousing on the slavery question, as they seemed to her to be shockingly indifferent. Not all of the Eagleswood students shared the ultra views of the Groomkie Welds on racial equality and women's rights, but the students' and teachers' letters indicate that these were issues discussed in the school and in the community, that individually and collectively they were grappling with the central issues of their time. 4 decades later, the second group of innovative educators came together, and this is John Dewey and the laboratory school teachers. Although there was a similar focus on independent thinking and on learning through active experiences, which were carefully designed, I've looked at John Dewey's digitized letters and published works, and I found no evidence that he was aware of Eagleswood School. In 1896, when Dewey founded the laboratory school at the University of Chicago, he wanted to figure out how to create a school community that brought about what he called the union of intellectual freedom and cooperation. Some decades later, he reflected on the school community's, quote, desire to discover how a school could become a cooperative community while developing in individuals their own capacities and satisfying their own needs. I've studied Dewey for a long time, and this is a quote I come back to over and over. And I think figuring out this relationship between individual flourishing and collective well-being remains at the heart of our work to try to improve education. In his Democracy in Education, his book of 1916, Dewey connected educational innovation to societal well-being. He wrote, "To organize education so that natural, active tendencies shall be fully enlisted in doing something, while seeing to it that the doing requires observation," again, like Eagleswood School, "the acquisition of information, and the use of a constructive imagination is what most needs to be done to improve social conditions." He acknowledged that this would not be easily or quickly accomplished. A reorganization of education so that learning takes place in connection with the intelligent carrying forward of purposeful activities is a slow work. It can only be accomplished piecemeal, a step at a time. But this is not a reason for nominally accepting one educational philosophy and accommodating ourselves in practice to another. It's a challenge to undertake the task of reorganization courageously and to keep at it persistently. So something I find so noteworthy in this quote is that I don't think we ordinarily put together courage and reorganization. But this is what he's saying, is that it takes courage to reorganize something like education. And yet we need to keep at it because we shouldn't be doing something that we don't think is the right thing to do. I mean, that's basically what he's saying here. As the Burlington teachers and students put it back in October, they designed backwards from their values to bring what they said, purpose, belonging, and imagination into their programs. The history of John Dewey's work with the lab school teachers offers us insights into how we can build this collective courage for the reorganization needed to create purposeful educational practices in communities. With its innovative pedagogical approaches and concern with what he called democracy of mind for teachers and students, the lab school represents Dewey's ideas, the enactment of Dewey's ideas, and an alternative to the traditional American school. So while he was directing the lab school, Dewey, along with William James, a philosopher, George Herbert Mead, who was one of Dewey's close friends and colleagues, Jane Addams, who started Hull House in Chicago, who was also a friend of John Dewey's, and others, they were working out the philosophy of pragmatism, which held that knowledge is the result of inquiry, which particularly for Dewey happened collectively. So the lab school community was an example of the pragmatic idea of a community of inquiry, what reformer Pauline Goldmark called a new adventure in education. As William James argued, for pragmatists, reality is still in the making and the universe is still pursuing its adventures. So another combination of words that I think is really important to think about that we don't often put together either. Education with adventure. You know, how do you think about education as an adventure? This is what they're getting at. So what this meant for the members of the lab school community was that in their daily work as teachers and learners, they were carrying out and reflecting on educational practices that promoted what Dewey called democracy as a way of life. The teachers were centrally involved in this experimentation. This is an outdoor lesson. This is the last home of the Dewey School, or the laboratory school. They were working together as competent inquirers, another pragmatic term from the philosophy of pragmatism. For Dewey, schools needed to reflect the ethical principle upon which democracy rests, the responsibility and freedom of mind in discovery and proof. So for Dewey, and the book, the title of the book, Democracy in Education, this was actually from an article called Democracy in Education. He connected democracy in education in a way that is so central to his thought, and that is really important, I think, to think about when we're considering how we can improve schools and for what purpose. The result was the atmosphere teacher Catherine Andrews Healey described when she wrote of her work with Dewey. We were all on a piece of research together, and never the least dictation, only a rare, open-minded attitude of inquiry on his part. The The theory of knowledge they were testing was Dewey's organic circuit, that knowing comes from doing and undergoing, reflecting on the consequences of one's actions in the world. A lot of times when people have heard of Dewey, they think of the phrase learning by doing, which is really part of that for him. It also meant that what he also argued was that in addition to doing, you also had to reflect on what you did and think about what you did. So similar to what the Eagleswood School teachers were talking about, what Eliza Newman's and Theodore Weld and others, this idea that you had to observe what you were doing and think about the consequences of what you did. So a teacher, Anne Camp Edwards, explained this as follows. She said, all acts of learning must involve thinking, feeling, and muscular effort. So in order to facilitate this, the content of the lab school was organized around what they called social occupations. These occupations included textiles, cooking, handwork. Probably one of the most famous things that happened in the lab school was that the children built a clubhouse, an actual clubhouse, because they wanted a place where they could socialize. So these occupations presented learners with the need of meeting some difficulty and reflecting upon, and this is Dewey's words, reflecting upon the best way of overcoming it. They provided material to create what Dewey called educative experiences. So what he meant by that was that not all experiences are going to be educative. We needed to think about what does make an experience educative. So central to the school's philosophy and practice was the development in students of the ability to observe the results of their actions, thus reflecting on their experiences and learning to think for themselves. To create these educative experiences, teachers needed to be subject matter experts, since for Dewey, education involves, quote, the searching out of facts and principles which were authentic and intellectually worthwhile, in contrast with wooden and sawdust stuff, which has played a large part in the traditional curriculum. It's another quote that I like to think about a lot because it's, he kind of helps you to imagine and envision what he means there by saying wooden and sawdust stuff. They also needed to be curious about children, so that as teachers Catherine Camp Mayhew and Camp Edwards wrote, with the inner eye, one caught glimpses of the might be in every child. Teachers also needed to be able to collaborate in an experimental context and examine their own work. This enabled the democratic structure at the lab school, in which teachers shared the results of their instruction through regular reports, meetings, and articles published in the University of Chicago journals, all of which meant that teaching at the laboratory school differed radically from the teaching in traditional schools with their top-down administration. One example, a good example of what this looked like at the lab school can be found in the cooking classes. It really shows the kind of inquiry-based learning that they were engaged in. So the classes included experimentation with foods such as rice, cheese, cocoa, potatoes, which was a real favorite there, followed by discussion of the results and preparing luncheons with the food items under investigation. As teacher Alice Lackman wrote in a report from the school from 1901, after what she called an experimental period, the children made all the things we had for luncheon except for the bread. One set of cooking lessons described in a report by teacher Althea Harmer involved studying breadstuffs, cooking carefully prepared luncheons, experimental work and practical tests, and a visit to a mill to trace the different processes in milling. So field trips, this is in the early 1900s. As Harmer wrote in a 1903 article, Elementary Cooking in the Laboratory School, cooking was particularly valuable in giving opportunity for individual work, initiative and independence, and also in calling for group work, which encourages a spirit of helpfulness and nice adjustment of the individual personalities to the work of the group as a whole. This occupation really illustrates the central issue and problem of the school, the central question of the school, which was how to foster individual growth while attending to the needs of the community. So as this example demonstrates, teaching and learning at the lab school involved not just new problems, but also promoting inquiry to what might seem ordinary. This was done through this kind of active experimentation, as shown in the cooking classes, but it was also done through a focus on discussion. As Mayhew and Edwards recalled, the method of conducting all classes through the medium of conversation and free exchange of ideas resulted in a uniform daily procedure which supplied the thread of continuity. For it linked the experience of previous days and weeks to the new or continued activity of the present. In all of this activity, invention and discovery found their place. Each classroom was a social laboratory, a place to experiment with ideas which carried a social import. So Dewey's close friend and colleague, George Herbert Mead, was quoting Dewey in a lecture, and he said that education is interchange of ideas, is conversation, belongs to a universe of discourse. So that is a quote that I really love, and especially thinking about 1910, it's not radically different now, but if you think about this idea of discourse, where people are talking, having a conversation, that wasn't certainly the case in a lot of traditional schools, where it was much more teacher-dominated, teacher-led, and the teachers themselves were not given the freedom in traditional schools to make decisions about education as they were at the lab school. And I connect this to recently in my teacher ed classes, I showed a TED talk to my students on math education by a math educator named Dan Finkel. And what he talked about was a classroom that comes alive with thinking, which is really an image that I just love to consider. So the curriculum at the lab school, with its focus on social occupations, created this framework for democratic education and independent thought, and it invited discussions that could have involved social and historical critique. The focus, however, was on involving students physically, mentally, and emotionally in solving immediate problems designed to engage their interest, and thus learning through inquiring together, acting on the world, and reflecting on the consequences of those actions. My investigation of the teachers' work reports indicates that there were opportunities for developing students' abilities to critique past and present social injustices that were passed by. In the history classes in particular, the standard textbook narrative that glorified exploration and colonization was in place, and thus perpetuated anti-Black and anti-Indigenous interpretations of history. At least a few teachers questioned this. Mary Hill was a laboratory school teacher and a resident of Jane Addams Hull House, where she was a founder of the Settlement House's Labor Museum. Hill wrote in a personal letter that for some of her fellow teachers, quote, some of their history is so expansionistic. Another teacher, Anna Camp, wrote to her family asking, what are Papa's views on expansion and imperialism? In spite of this individual questioning of the prevailing textbook narratives, that kind of social critique was not central to the school's curriculum. But since conversation and inquiry were at the heart of the school, some of the history instruction outlined in the work reports did yield discussions in which students questioned the standard historical narrative. For example, in a history lesson with Georgia Bacon, students studied what was known as the Black Hawk War of 1832. And as she wrote in the report, even after the children were, quote, told at the beginning that this war resulted in good for the town of Chicago, at least some of the children were on the side of the Indians in the contest, saying that if the white men had not been so greedy, there need not to have been any trouble, as there was room for all. So in this report, Bacon didn't reflect on the meaning of this discussion. She didn't say that she took it any further, that she and the students took it any further. And there's not a thread of historical critique throughout the reports. So this focus on experimentation and discussion at the lab school meant that the teachers were central to the reorganization of the school, which distinguished it from the schools of its time in a lot of its pedagogical practices, but not in the interpretive content of the history curriculum. Consistent with Dewey's philosophy, the teachers exercised agency in their jobs, and they and their students experienced a degree of what Dewey called intellectual freedom, unknown to many teachers and students of their time. As Jarvis R. Givens argues in Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson in The Art of Black Teaching, For Woodson and his fellow black teachers in Jim Crow America, the freedom they sought in education for themselves and their students was of another magnitude. It was freedom to see themselves in the curriculum, to prepare students to critique the system that negated their role in history. The social critique that happened at the margins of the lab school was central to the black teachers during the era of Jim Crow, who are the subjects of Given's book, and the third group I'll discuss today. In his book, Givens asks, what was the human vision within education, and in what ways were black students allowed to see themselves in that vision? As he argues, Woodson created and disseminated curriculum materials to black teachers that enabled them to address the erasures of black lives and the racist distortions of history throughout the American school curriculum. Givens opens his book with the story of a black teacher in Louisiana in the 1930s, Tessie Mcgee, who read from the official textbook while being observed by administrators, but in her lap rested one of Carter G. Woodson's books on black history, which she read from when she was alone with her students. This example of what Givens calls fugitive pedagogy illustrates how Tessie Mcgee and other black teachers of the time made sure that their students understood what Givens argues is a counter-historical narrative and way of knowing, which was contained in the resources that Woodson and others created for teachers. These textbooks enable black teachers to counter the prevailing historical narrative found in standard curriculum materials. For example, according to the state-adopted textbook, which is right here, from 1935 that Tessie Mcgee was supposed to teach from, not only are almost all the civilized nations of today of the white race, but throughout all the historic ages, this race has taken the lead and has been foremost in the world's progress. In this book, Modern Times and the Living Past, the author Henry W. Elson states that he's presenting a history of the world in a single volume, and yet almost the entire book is about Europe. The expansionism that the two lab school teachers questioned was addressed as follows. Europe constitutes about 1/15 of the world's land area, but the European states control more than half the Earth's surface. In his explanation of the consequences of the American Revolution, Elson wrote, Great Britain was in some measure compensated for her losses in America by acquiring complete control of Australia. And here's Elson's definition of an American. So the future American will forget whether he is descended from English, German, Dutch, Scandinavian, French, or Italian ancestry, or from all of them, nor will he care. His pride will be that he is an American. So books such as Woodson's countered this dominant narrative. And through his work, as Givens argues, he created a distinct theory of education that was separate from mainstream thought as well as from the ideas developed by Dewey and others during the Progressive era. According to Givens, Tessie Mcgee's fugitive instructional practice was a refusal of the narrative condemnation of black life facilitated by Louisiana's official curriculum. At the heart of her pedagogy was an insistence that there was a different way of knowing the world. And as he further states, a central objective of education must be to support students in thinking critically about their social and historical realities. There's much to be learned from these teachers who risk so much in order to prepare their students to develop these critical understandings and to think for themselves. Carter G. Woodson was held up by other black teachers as a schoolmaster to his race. In addition to writing and promoting textbooks that teachers could use, he also created networks for black teachers that provided them with support, the support necessary to think against the grain of these predominant systems of American schooling. As Givens puts it, these support networks transform the representation of black life and culture in Western knowledge, and in doing so, transform knowledge itself and promoted a vision that, quote, accounted for the learning experiences of students in schools. So in their creativity and love of learning, the black teachers Givens writes about, who were led by Carter G. Woodson, both exhibited and taught their students to develop what Givens calls rigorous sight, the ability to see, observe, and think for themselves. And they serve as examples of what he calls scholars of the practice. So in practicing this fugitive pedagogy, they showed, quote, what it means to put this philosophical ideal of education as freedom into practice. Their work deepens and clearly illustrates a hard-won intellectual freedom, to use Dewey's words, and brought the focus on such freedom and on independent thinking directly to bear on a critique of the existing school systems and social systems and structures that dominated life in the U.S. during this time. So for someone in the field of educational history like myself, and who also is a teacher-educator, I'm inclined to think about lessons for today from our past. So looking at these three groups of educational innovators, I've tried to show how they all, in different ways, fostered the independent thinking of students and teachers, while attending to the flourishing of the common good or the collective. So with Eagleswood, this was through innovative practices, what we'd call active learning, by including discussions of slavery from the perspective of abolitionists. In the lab school, it was also through innovative pedagogy, focusing on social occupations, on democracy of mind, which was Dewey's phrase, through inquiry-based learning. With Carter G. Woodson and the Black teachers during Jim Crow, their focus is on changing the curriculum materials by including Black history, and as Gibbon says, creating a new way of seeing the world. So it's important, I think, that we support teachers' efforts to work as a part of these communities of inquiry, what the Burlington panelists I've spoken about called thinking as a group and as a collective. This means that we need to support our teachers to think independently and with rigor about their students and about the school content and about the social structures in place inside and outside of schools, so that they're practicing purposeful teaching and they're thinking about questions in education that start with why. There's a political theorist, and actually I just found out she's candidate for governor in Massachusetts, named Danielle Allen, who my students read in one of my classes. She says, historical evidence often turns up only when one starts to look for it. And history won't answer questions until one thinks to ask them. So what I think these educational innovators from our past help us think about is that teachers of today, we need to support teachers to think, to ask these kinds of questions in the hopes that this will promote the independent thinking that these educators from our history in their own different ways sought to promote in their students. The beginning of the pandemic forced all of us across the globe to implement sudden changes in our daily lives, including in our schools. Dewey writes about the importance of a common project to develop individuality in students. And this common project that he considered central was made even more difficult to bring to life as students and teachers across the world, really, were meeting over computer screens. We're still figuring this out, of course, but as Gloria Latson-Billings argues, when we emerge from this crisis, we shouldn't be aiming to go back to the, quote, old normal, because that wasn't working for a lot of our most vulnerable students. In our efforts to improve education, we can keep in mind the words of lab school teachers, Mayhew and Edwards, who recalled working together with the feeling of joy in its adventure. Eagleswood teacher Eliza Ann Yeomans argued we need to teach students to observe the world with care. We also need to support what Jarvis Givens calls the rigorous sight of the Black teachers in Jim Crow America, the ability and desire to see educational practices and policies with a critical eye, thus able to work collectively to make necessary changes, and to go back to Dewey's words that I read from earlier, this idea of finding courage to reorganize so that our practices are in line with what we know to be good for children and young people. Thank you so much.